smoke again. Third floor of Vicus Patricius in the Subura district, somewhere past midnight. The timber under your sleeping mat creaks the way it does every night a brazier burns too close below. Iron-rimmed cartwheels grind over the basalt paving outside, the only traffic Rome allows after dark, and somewhere down the stairwell a wax and oil lamp has already singed the plaster twice this month. The cesspit smell drifting up from the street never fully leaves the air no matter how high you climb. A dog barks twice, then stops, then nothing. 40 people live in this insula. None of them know each other's names, and most of them sleep with one ear open anyway, listening for the particular crackle that means run, not the ordinary one that means someone's making dinner. You earn your bread hauling crates near the Forum Holatorium 6 days out of 7, your hands cracked from rope and salt, and you've heard the story everyone tells about people like you more times than you can count. Starving, bones bowed from hunger, surviving on watered wine while patricians up on the Palatine eat roasted dormice and oysters packed in snow shipped down from the Apennines. It's a clean story. It explains the cramped room, the cheap bread, the empty stomach you've assumed, comes standard with all of it. It fits everything you've ever heard about Rome's poor, and it fits what you've felt in your own stomach more nights than you'd like to admit. The bones disagree. So if hunger isn't actually what's destroying the lives of Rome's urban poor, what is? It is the early 2nd century AD, under the reign of Trajan, and roughly 1 million people are packed inside Rome's walls, more humans per square mile than any city on earth would see again for another 17 centuries. Walk 10 minutes in any direction from the Forum and the marble columns disappear, replaced by mud brick, exposed timber, and laundry strung between windows close enough to touch. The Subura sits low in the bowl between the Viminal and Esquiline hills, a maze of 7-story insulae built from timber frame and rubble concrete, legally capped at 70 Roman feet by Augustus, and capped lower still after the Great Fire of 64 AD scorched half the city under Nero. Ground floors hold tabernae selling wine, nails, and second-hand sandals. Upper floors hold whole families crammed into single rented rooms with no kitchen, no running water, and one shared latrine 3 flights down that nobody bothers using after dark, which is exactly why chamber pots get emptied straight out the window instead, often onto whoever happens to be walking below, a habit common enough that Roman jurists eventually wrote specific liability rules for it into civil law. Cooking happens on a portable brazier balanced near an open shutter, which is exactly as dangerous as it sounds, and exactly why insulae burned so often, sometimes twice in the same decade on the same street, rebuilt each time slightly cheaper and slightly higher than the height limit technically allowed. A subsidized grain ration arrives monthly through the Cura Annone, the state grain dole that Gaius Gracchus first pushed through in 123 BC, and that Augustus later expanded to feed 250,000 citizens by name, registered on wax tablets and checked off one by one at the distribution point near the Tiber's grain warehouses. Bread is everywhere. Garum is everywhere too, even the cheapest fermented fish grades, sold by the cup at the corner counter for less than a loaf costs. Posca, the vinegar and water drink of soldiers and the poor, costs less than a single as, and pulse, the old plebeian grain porridge, fills in whatever's left of the week when coin runs short. Aediles, the magistrates technically responsible for inspecting buildings and fining negligent landlords, exist on paper throughout this period, but with one office covering thousands of insulae across 14 sprawling regions. Enforcement mostly happens after a building has already come down, not before. Cicero himself owned a handful of these buildings as rental property, And in one letter to his friend Atticus, he mentions, almost casually, that two of his shops had collapsed, and a third was cracking down the middle, then notes dryly that at least the rents hadn't dropped along with the walls. On paper, this looks like survival right at the edge of starvation, propped up by handouts. Watered down, the exact kind of life that should leave a visible mark on every skeleton ever pulled from a Roman grave. Hold on, in the 2000s, bioarchaeologist Christina Kilgrove ran stable isotope analysis on skeletons recovered from imperial-era cemeteries on the outskirts of Rome, ordinary burial grounds for ordinary people, not senators, not equestrians, just the anonymous dead of the urban poor. Dozens of individuals pulled from unmarked graves and run through a mass spectrometer instead of a history book. The method reads the chemical signature locked permanently into bone collagen and tooth enamel, a record of what a person actually ate across years of real meals, not what a satirist claimed they ate in a single furious complaint written for laughs. The reasonable hypothesis writes itself. Bread doll families crammed into Subura rentals should show the chemical fingerprint of a grain-heavy, protein-starved diet. Thin, monotonous, propped up by little more than wheat and watered wine. They didn't. Let that actually sink in. The bones of Rome's urban poor carried strong, consistent signatures of fish protein and animal protein, in some individuals just as strong as what turns up in higher status burials elsewhere in the empire, with no clean dividing line between the diet of a freedman and the diet of someone several rungs above him. A separate excavation backs this up from an entirely different angle. Beneath an ordinary apartment block in Herculaneum, sealed under volcanic ash since 79 AD, archaeologists pulled an entire sewer's worth of food waste out of the ground. Thousands of fish bones, sea urchin shells, and discarded scraps from people who had no senatorial pretensions whatsoever, just rented rooms and modest jobs, and an apparently unremarkable habit of eating seafood most nights. Average adult stature, another marker bioarchaeologists track closely because chronic malnutrition tends to stunt growth, also shows no dramatic gap between the Subura's likely residents and Romans buried in wealthier contexts elsewhere, which is exactly the kind of negative result that should have shown up if the starvation story were true and simply didn't. Picture your own version of this. You assume the food bank line eats worse than the bistro 2 blocks away, and then a nutritionist actually runs the blood work and finds the line is doing fine, because volume and subsidy beat scarcity, the same way a well-stocked cafeteria quietly beats a fashionable restaurant that only serves 4 tables a night. None of this means Roman childhood was easy. Kilgrove's skeletons still show stress markers like cribra orbitalia, tiny pitting in the eye sockets that bioarchaeologists read as a sign of hard, sometimes hungry, childhood years. But those markers cluster around early life, not adulthood, which tells a very specific story. Kids got squeezed during weaning and growth spurts, and then the system caught up and fed them properly for the rest of their working lives. Rome wasn't running its poor on cruelty. It was running on the same logic as a national food program. Bulk grain, bulk fish sauce, bulk subsidized protein, distributed wide instead of plated beautifully for the few. The mechanism even has a name you can look up yourself, the cura annonay, paired with what chemists call stable isotope analysis, the literal chemistry of who got fed in Rome and how well they actually ate. None of it required a single Roman to be kind. It just required the system to keep running. Juvenal complained loudly, at length, about the indignity of standing in the grain line. He never once complained about what came home in the sack. Picture an ordinary tenant of the Subura in the late Republic, sometime in the 70s BC. A freedman renting one room on an insula's fourth floor, eating bread and the cheapest grade of garum, climbing the same groaning staircase every evening past tabernet, selling wine by the cup and oil by the jug, owning nothing he couldn't carry down those stairs in one trip if he absolutely had to. His insula catches fire the way they did constantly in this district, walls of timber and wattle packed so tightly that flame jumps roof to roof in minutes, faster than anyone can reach the street, let alone gather their belongings. A private fire company arrives within the hour, 500 slaves under the personal command of Marcus Licinius Crassus, then one of the wealthiest men in the Republic, and a man who understood real estate the way a vulture understands weather. They do not put out the fire. Per Plutarch's account of Crassus, the brigade simply stands and waits while the terrified owner negotiates, refusing to lift a single bucket of water until the burning property, and often the still intact buildings beside it, is sold to Crassus at a price that barely covers a month's rent. He rebuilds, he re-rents, a meaningful share of the fortune that later made Crassus the richest man in the Republic, reportedly worth 200 million sesterces, was assembled one smoke-filled negotiation at a time, building by building, fire by fire, year after year, while tenants like our freedmen simply moved to whichever insula happened to still be standing. The racket reportedly ran for years without serious challenge, because no magistrate wanted to pick a fight with a man who could fund half the Senate's election campaigns out of pocket. Our freedman, for what it's worth, almost certainly never learns any of this. He just notices, one generation later, that fires in the Subura stop being a death sentence and start being an inconvenience, and he has no idea he has Augustus's tax on slave sales to thank for the difference. Then, in 6 AD, Augustus ends the racket for good. He creates the Vigileser Barney, 7 permanent cohorts of freedmen firefighters, roughly 1,000 men per cohort, funded by a new tax on slave sales, and stationed across all 14 of Rome's regions, with the specific job of reaching insulae before any private operator could repeat the Crassus model ever again. The tenant in the Subura now gets water on his fire within the hour, free, with no negotiation required and no buyer circling the wreckage waiting for a signature. The senator in his stone domus on the Palatine barely notices the reform at all, because he never needed the Vigiles in the first place. His house was already built from materials that don't burn in 20 minutes, already watched around the clock by his own household slaves long before Augustus ever signed anything. The reform outlives Augustus himself, folded permanently into the office of the Praefectus Vigilum, a standing fixture of urban life for the rest of the empire's history. Same city, same fires, completely different stakes depending on which side of the insula. Juvenal lived through real Roman hunger, not a hypothetical one, and his satires describe citizens packed into the forum, frantic, shoving for grain when the Egyptian shipping fleet ran late that season. He wasn't writing fiction, and he wasn't writing for an audience that would let him get away with inventing a famine out of thin air. This part is real, and it isn't a small detail to wave away. Suetonius records Emperor Claudius getting physically mobbed in the forum during a grain shortage, pelted with crusts and curses by a crowd that had genuinely gone hungry that particular month, and the whole system depended entirely on cargo ships crossing open water from Alexandria, which means one bad storm season could turn subsidized abundance into a citywide crisis within a matter of weeks, with no backup plan beyond imperial panic and emergency price fixing. None of that is exaggeration, and no honest account of Rome pretends otherwise. Tacitus describes grain shortages spiking the price of wheat so sharply that emperors occasionally had to personally intervene just to stop riots from spreading past the forum into the residential districts. Where the objection falls short is in confusing a fragile system with a failing one. The isotope data Kilgrove and others recovered reflects years of average diet, the baseline most Romans actually lived on between crises, not the single worst week of a supply disruption that historians, naturally, wrote about precisely because it was dramatic and worth recording for an audience that loved a good crisis. A modern airline's worst storm cancellation week makes every headline in the country. Its average Tuesday doesn't make the news at all, and nobody writes an essay about the flights that landed exactly on time. The same selection bias runs through nearly every ancient source historians rely on because satirists and biographers wrote to be read, and nothing kept a Roman audience reading like outrage. Rome's grain system worked the overwhelming majority of the time and broke memorably and visibly on the rare occasions it didn't, which is exactly why Juvenal had something worth writing about, and exactly why an ordinary Tuesday left no trace in the bones whatsoever. So the question becomes, if hunger wasn't the baseline condition crushing Rome's poor, what actually was? In the insulae of the Subura, the answer is architecture, not appetite, that made daily life miserable. Because 7 stories of timber, rubble concrete, and open flame packed at a density no modern fire code would ever permit turned every winter into a lottery of collapse and fire. The 2 causes of death Roman sources mention obsessively, and modern bioarchaeology backs up with healed and unhealed fracture patterns recovered straight from the skeletal record. The grain dole solved hunger. It never once solved gravity, or fire, or the simple math of cramming 40 families into a building rated for far fewer. In the Domus of the Palatine and the Esquiline, the answer becomes safety without dietary superiority, because stone construction, private slaves on permanent firewatch, and single-story ground-floor living solved the exact physical danger that defined poverty everywhere else in the city, while the food on both tables, garum and bread and watered wine, looked far more similar than either class would ever have guessed at a dinner party where the 2 of them somehow ended up seated together. The opposite would only be true in a Rome without the Cura Annonae and without the Vigiles Urbani, a city where grain wasn't subsidized at all and fires weren't fought by the state under any circumstances. Those exact conditions did exist in plenty of smaller provincial towns scattered across the empire, places with no dole and no brigade to catch anyone, where survival really did come down to personal wealth alone, and where the gap between rich and poor stayed exactly as brutal as the old story claims it was across the whole of Rome itself. Here's what all of this actually means. None of it lives in a museum case. It lives in the small, specific moments of your own week, the ones you've probably never connected to anyone wearing a toga. Every time you felt physically unsafe inside your own apartment, a fire alarm that doesn't work, a landlord who won't fix the wiring, a building you quietly suspect wouldn't hold up if anything actually went wrong, you already understand exactly what it felt like to fall asleep on the 4th floor of a Subura insula, listening to the timber creak below you. Every time you've stood in a grocery store running math against a paycheck, quietly relieved that some public program covered the gap your wallet couldn't, you've lived a smaller version of what the Cura Annonae did for 250,000 Romans who never went hungry, because a system fed them, not a sympathetic patrician who happened to notice their need that day. Every time you felt invisible in a room where only the senior people speak while a decision about your rent or your job gets made above your head, you already understand exactly what it meant to stand in the forum as a plebeian while a patrician senator weighed your future like an afterthought between other business. And every time you've watched someone wealthy turn your crisis into their profit, a landlord buying up distressed units below market, a buyer circling a foreclosure with cash already in hand, you've watched the ghost of Marcus Licinius Crassus's fire brigade standing outside a burning building, doing absolutely nothing, waiting patiently for the price to drop low enough. None of that makes you weak or careless or bad with money. It makes you part of the same pattern that shaped life on the fourth floor of an insula 2,000 years ago, where the danger was never really the food on the table. Rome didn't starve its poor. It built their home